Good morning, everyone, in U.S. History 2. It's time for a quick chapter review, or quick for me, anyways, of Chapter 23, The Great Depression. Um, Very important chapter. It's sort of in my bailiwick or interests personally. Like, you guys have picked a topic for your papers. I always think of the Great Depression as one of the more fascinating periods of American history. And it segues right into World War II. But the Great Depression, most people identify it with the stock market crash of 1929. It started initially on October 24th, and the market started plunging. We know JP Morgan raised millions of dollars, reinvested, tried to act like everything was okay. And it did shore up the market for a couple of days, but we know on what was called Black Tuesday, the market really crashed. Stocks such as U.S. Steel went from $262 a share all the way down to $22 a share. General Motors stock fell from $73 a share to $8 a share. So they're losing 90% of the value of some of these major stocks. And a lot of people think, well, what caused the depression was the stock market crash. That's part of it. It's more symbolic of what was going on. There was underlying foundational problems with our economy, with world economy, actually. And the stock market was evidence of those failures or those weaknesses. The stock market did contribute to it, the crash, no question about it, especially the panic aspect of it, because with panic, people removed their money from investments, moved them out of the market, moved them out of banks, and there was significant bank collapse during this era. And as a result of that, certainly contributed to it. But I thought the book did a nice job revealing that it was much greater than just simply this stock bubble that bursts and therefore the entire economy collapses in catastrophic form. And I just want to read right from the textbook. Those of you who aren't reading, or sometimes just to hear it, really sums it up. It said the stock market crash exposed a great number of factors that, when combined with the financial panic was a big part of the underlying damage that was done. But it goes on, sank the American economy into the greatest of all economic crises. Rising inequality, very rich, very poor and middling groups, and the very rich were a very small percentage of the American people. Declining demand. So there's all this product, luxury products, appliances, cars, you name it. Products are being manufactured at a very rapid rate. And now the supply is greater than the demand, and the demand drops off swiftly. Rural collapse. The rural collapse, the agricultural commodities market was always in distress in the 1920s. Farmers were getting less money for harder work and more production, and they were already hurting significantly. It just didn't capture the imagination of the American people, other than the American farmers themselves. So there was already an agricultural a challenge going on prior to the stock market crash. Overextended investors, people were investing not with their own money, but they're investing with credit. And then when it came due to be paid, they couldn't pay it, so they go bankrupt and they lose their jobs, they lose their homes. It's just unbelievable ripple effect. So overextended investors and the bursting of speculative bubbles all conspired to plunge the nation into the Great Depression. So it was a very complex set of formulas that did that. And a lot of people think in the early 1920s everyone was working, but actually right up to the height of the roaring 20s, there was a 7% unemployment rate, which is a fairly significant unemployment rate. It's not double digits, but it's not that far from it. We usually consider full employment somewhere around, I don't know, maybe 3% unemployment, because there's always going to be some people employed from job shifting and things of that nature. 7% is a little bit higher than what people would think for a booming economy. And this set of factors, along with the Republican conservative ideology over the management of business, laissez-faire, business take care of itself, help lead to the demise of it. I'm not blaming the Republicans. It's still a popular view to this day that business knows best. And sometimes government staying out of the way of business can lead to industrial and business flourishing. The less red tape, the less government oversight, the more, in the old Darwinist theory, the strongest and the fittest survive. It leads to better products, cheaper products, competition is good. Government stay the hell out was the mentality. But one thing where government did get involved was making the biggest tariff in history. This was during Hoover's administration. Hoover's not that bad a guy individually. He gets blamed for everything. the highest tariff in history basically does what? Well, it basically tries to help American industry. A lot of people still believe in that to this day. Hey, let's have a high tariff against foreign goods. So if I'm the manufacturer of coffee cups here in Massachusetts, I want people in Massachusetts, in the country, the United States, to buy my product. I don't want them to buy cheap cups that are maybe of competitive structuring and things like that, but because of their labor costs and things are much cheaper, boy, if there's no foreign competition, I'm going to do well. So let's really raise the tariffs. And that's kind of the argument behind high tariffs, is isolationism. Problem is, what does it do? I'm not going to be able, what do you think foreign countries are going to do? Well, they're going to raise their tariffs too. So I'm not going to have any ability to have foreign markets buy into my product. So we became very insular. And as a result of that, that also was part of the economic downfall of the Great Depression. Yeah, it was the Smoot-Hawley Act or tariff of 1930, and American exports fell during this area by 78%. So the economy is already suffering because of the large tariffs. We're trying to help homegrown manufacturers. There's no question about that, but you kill the exports entirely. It was huge. And so some of the things they go through, one of the major, and it says one of the factors that are only related to sort of human psychology, panic. And that's what people did. They panicked. They took their money out of banks. They took it out of investments. And therefore, the economy suffers dramatically. And every so often, we see that phenomenon in the stock market. Now there's a lot of regulation and a lot of mechanisms that prevent sort of panic. And there's also government backup of traditional bank deposit with the FDIC. I think it's up to $250,000, which is fairly significant. People have much more faith in their securities, especially some securities are guaranteed by the federal government. Not all. If stock market's not. You can have a stock market crash, and there's arguments that that could happen again because there are bubbles, but the bubble will never burst the same way it did in 1929. Created the Securities and Exchange Commission, other things like that, put certain prophylactic protections in to prevent that kind of panic selling. There's curbs, things of that nature. When panic selling occurs, the government can slow down the process. Banks failed. This is one of the most amazing things about banks. They were lending money improvidently to people that couldn't afford to pay it back. But think about it. I got $20,000 in the bank, for example, what would happen back in this era if the banks closed? They basically went insolvent. I'd lose my $20,000. Now the federal government, as a result of the Depression, backs up deposits in traditional savings and checking accounts. But look at the 1932, nearly 2,300 banks collapsed, taking personal deposits, savings, and credit with them. That's really an amazing phenomenon. Those of you that are fans of old movies like I am, my favorite movie is It's a Wonderful Life, and George Bailey owns a small building and loan company. And in the process of the movie, he gets married in 1929, and he's about to go off on his honeymoon, has all of his money saved up. They're going to travel, I guess, the world for the summer or something like that. It wasn't to be summer because it happened in October, right? Or the fall, whatever they're going to go on their trip. And in the movie, he's leaving in the taxi with his buddy Ernie driving it, and they look back and they see all these lines in front of the bank, and then they realize that there's a rush on the banks, and he owns a building loan, and people are rushing his. He takes his $5,000 and basically doesn't spend it on his world travel honeymoon with his wife, the actress Donna Reed, the former Mary Hatch was a character's name in the movie. I'm not much into that movie, but anyways, and that was the relevation of it encapsulates, and they use that little film clip quite a bit in classes and things like that. If you study the history of the Depression and banking and how banks don't necessarily have the money that you put in there, it's invested in mortgages and things like that. And if there's a run on the bank, they don't necessarily have all that cash. But now there's certain regulatory means that the banks have to have a certain amount of cash in reserve and have these stress tests to make sure that they can handle major demands on removing deposits with them. I'm way off track, but you get the idea. During this era, it's totally unregulated, and with panic comes collapse. And Herbert Hoover, great guy, great politician. He was a Republican, a traditional Republican. In fact, he was identified with the philosophy of the Republican Party. But he's a good guy. He's really not a decent. He's not a decent, or not a brutal person by any means. He gets that reputation a little bit in history because the Great Depression leaves him a bit flat-footed, and he doesn't take government action to help forestall some of the hurting. There's some arguments that maybe even some of the government action that was ultimately implemented didn't really have huge impacts, but he was perceived as doing basically nothing. And he, being a humanitarian, and no question about it, urged private charities and organizations and businesses to basically help out the poor and impoverished and do what they could. But eventually, many charities actually closed up there in this area because they just got tapped out completely. And so Hoover gets the blame. During Calvin Coolidge, Silent Cal, who basically said very little, he leaves right at the right time. I don't know if he saw the writing on the wall, but he leaves in 1928, and he looks like he was, responsible for the Roaring Twenties and the success. Poor Herbert Hoover comes in, who is a good man. He really is. He actually helped manage the World War One European Aid Society, and did some wonderful things, and was known to be a wizard of organization. He was a former engineer, grew up as an orphan, and uncle ultimately took him in, but he was highly educated, really smart guy. But he believed in that laissez-faire attitude. The government just doesn't get involved in these things, and we're going to bounce right back. And there was an attitude during that era that they would bounce right back. It didn't bounce right back. And Hoover, although extremely, extremely popular, he was elected in one of the biggest landslides in history. And the first time since Reconstruction, the end of the Civil War, the Republicans were considered pariahs in the southern states. Not anymore. Herbert Hoover, because of his laissez-faire attitude and because his opponent was Al Smith of New York, a Catholic, very significant anti-Catholic sentiment in the South. Not only that, he was anti-prohibition. The South was fairly much in favor of prohibition. And he was also part of the machine politics in New York, made him extremely unpopular in the South. So Al Smith, in terms of policy statements, was very, very similar to Hoover, but Hoover, being a Protestant, Midwestern, Republican, in favor of prohibition, was widely popular throughout the United States. It was one of the biggest landslides. Yeah. Matter of fact, it says right here, it says, several southern states, in part owing to the work of itinerant evangelistic preachers, would actually preach against Al Smith and in favor of Hoover, voted Republican for the first time since Reconstruction. Hoover won in a landslide, taking nearly 60% of the popular vote. That would be considered huge. And his whole thing about, repairing the economy when it collapsed was volunteerism. People have to look to their churches, their aid societies, and other fraternal and societal benefactors that will help society. Government really needs to just stay out and encourage business to move forward. Unfortunately, some of the things he first implements is dumping money and taxpayer dollars into businesses in order to revive the economy, and that gets perceived very negatively. It doesn't look like he's trying to help the people. He's trying to help business, and what it got coined as a new dole for millionaires. And there's some argument there that it was true. So Hoover's a bit we call tone deaf to what everyday American people are suffering from during the Depression. And there's a term for it. I should look it up. But if you take your pants pockets and put them inside out, I think they're called Hoover. Let me just look up the term right here real quick. I hope I don't blow this whole because you don't want to hear me just sitting here silently. There's a term for it. Yeah, a Hoover flag. A Hoover flag was when your pockets were basically inside out, hanging outside your pants, because it was a Hoover flag waving the fact that you were totally impoverished, and a lot of Americans were. A lot of parents, there's a lot of homelessness, people lost their homes, and they built up shanties in many major cities, just on the outskirts of major cities. They were called Hoovervilles. In the very first, one of the Hoovervilles was something called the Bonus Army. World War I veterans were going to be promised a bonus, but it was supposed to come in the 1940s. And now there was a move to accelerate it because all these World War I veterans, we often honor them, and we should honor them if they're broke financially because of the Great Depression. And so there was a movement, and a bill was passed or going through Congress to give the bonuses early, and they marched on Washington. And when they went down to Washington, they encamped in thousands of them. And there's a picture in your book of these like shanties they built up, urging Congress to give them this bonus. Hoover was against it, and a lot of people think Hoover killed it, but he didn't. The Senate, which was Republican controlled at the time, the Senate never passed it, so it didn't pass. But a lot of they're called the Bonus Army that was down there, they stayed, and Hoover had enough, and he said these people can't be out there in these shanties and basically being insurrectionists, and that's what he saw them as. He couldn't identify with them in terms of a a psychological connection about their woes. They were homeless. They might as well stay in these little shanties, these shacks everywhere. And eventually he sent in the military under Douglas MacArthur, who gets fame later on. But Douglas MacArthur has a mixed history, and this is one of his bad points. He brings in the military police and everything else, and he routs them. He gets them the hell out of it, and he burns down the entire shanty town. And that left a very, very bitter resentment towards Hoover by many of the World War I veterans, but also by a lot of the American people, seeing how he basically routed people clamoring for aid, and it was really sad. And here's where a line I underlined just to kind of really push forward what it meant. Hoover's insensitivity towards suffering Americans, and I don't think he was a bad person, but I just think he was, like I said, tone deaf. He didn't quite get how many Americans were really suffering. His unwillingness to address widespread economic problems in his repeated platitudes about returning prosperity coming around the corner, it condemned his presidency. It's not that he didn't do anything. He thought that was his role, that the government shouldn't do everything. And he said the businesses will recover, it'll bounce back, but this was a much deeper problem than I think Hoover ever appreciated. And people suffered in unbelievable fashion. If you want to read a book about the Great Depression, I think is fantastic. Doris Kearns Goodwin. I don't know if she lives in Massachusetts, but she often visits and speaks at different universities. She's a great writer. She wrote Team of Rivals about Lincoln's administration and how he brought in many people that were rivaling him in political life because he wanted to bring in voices of dissension in order to pick the right path. I think you need to hear from all sides. So that she wrote that great book, Pulitzer Prize winning book called Team of Rivals. But she also wrote another book that I think is even better, in my opinion, because I'm into the Depression era studies. It's something called No Ordinary Time, and it really wasn't. Just as a way of a quick example, my buddy's father grew up during the Depression, and he took him to Hyde Park, and that's where Franklin Delano Roosevelt grew up. And people of that era that lived through it and saw the efforts that Franklin Delano Roosevelt implemented, it was very radical during his era, and it's still considered somewhat radical even to this day. Social Security, old age pensions, financial resources to protect banks, aid to farmers to actually pay them not to grow produce, because it helps regenerate not only the fields, but it helps raise the commodity prices for all these really radical things that government did. FDR was perceived as being on the people's side like no other point in history. And when my friend brought his dad up to Hyde Park, and you go through you can't take pictures or anything like that. His father was behind FDR's chair, and he has a picture of his father like with his head down, and he was sobbing, he was crying, because that's how big FDR's identification with everyday people, even though he was a multimillionaire himself, he was very, very rich. And he was, he knew the best ways of living in terms of being very, very wealthy. He identified with the woes of the nation, and he took action, and there's no question about it. So migration in the Great Depression, I'm a little bit out of order, but migration in the Great Depression, we know because of the over farming of western prairie land, southwestern United States, all through that era, there was a very moist 1920s. There was a lot of rainfall. We got away with it, for lack of a better way of saying it. But these lands were depleted. There was no sod or soil coverage, very little trees, and now a drought hits. And so we got this great economic bust, a drought hits, this topsoil becomes dust, and that's why the nickname the Dust Bowl, and it blew like hell. So these people are removed from their farms are foreclosed upon. Even if they weren't, the farmland is worthless. They can't farm there anymore, and it creates a huge exodus. And the exodus is usually to California. And if you're a fan of folk music, like I am, I'm a fan of most music, but folk music with Woody Guthrie, much of his music was about traveling and about this sort of vagabond period of time where people just got uprooted from their homes and had no place to go, and they'd wander and travel, and mostly trying to get to California, to the promised land, for lack of a better way of saying it, where it seemed like there was rumored to be jobs and agricultural successes out in that region. And that's where the famous book, The Grapes of Wrath, was written, in the movie with Henry Ford? No, it's not Henry Ford, is it? Boy, I'm terrible with names lately. Get a little bit of worried about Henry Ford's the producer of the Ford automobile. I'm thinking of the great actor, and Henry Fonda, I apologize, but The Grapes of Wrath won the Oscar. John Steinbeck was the Pulitzer Prize winner for this book, capturing what it was like to be an Okie. That's the term, is a derogatory term from people from Oklahoma. Oklahoma lost, I did underline the Exodus. Oklahoma lost 440,000 people in this era. The population doesn't sound like big today, but in that era, 440,000 people left the state. 18% of its population in 1930 fled the state of Oklahoma. The farms are basically dust bowls, and they got to go somewhere else. And many of them tried to go to California, and some of them only found greater heartache there. In fact, even though it's unconstitutional, some states tried to bar other people from other states even coming in. They would put up signs, you're barred, and they would create roadblocks and turn people away. I don't think they can do that constitutionally, but states were saying, we got to protect our own residents of our state, and we don't want people coming in to undermine the wages and the work available for our home residents. And you're coming in from Oklahoma and other states in the Dust Bowl, and you're going to undermine our state's economy. And although, yeah, here it is right here. A billboard outside of Tulsa, Oklahoma, informed potential migrants that there were no jobs in California and warned them to keep out. When you got to the California border, you were often, militia groups sometimes would be set up to keep these migrant farmers and families out of the state. Can you imagine that? Imagine, I'm in distress in Massachusetts, so I want to move to New York State or Connecticut or Vermont or New Hampshire, and at the border they don't let me in as an American citizen. But that's what happened during this era. And we know there was also a problem with Europeans. We often thought foreign immigrants, this is a worldwide economic problem as well. So foreign immigrants are also seeing maybe America's got better opportunities too. But the number of European fell roughly 60%, and deportations dramatically increased. So there's an immigrant sentiment during this period of time. Especially true of Mexican immigrants, Mexican Americans. I'm not talking about just Mexican immigrants that are non-citizens. Citizens, United States citizens of Mexican origin were often deported during this period of time. Real tragic bit of history that a lot of people don't like to talk about. According to the federal census from 1930 to 1940, the Mexican-born population living in Arizona, California, New Mexico fell from 616,000 people to 377, almost half left that region. Some of them might not be citizens, but many of them were. There's a lot of evidence that many were United States citizens. And here's an interesting fact. Over the course of the Depression, more people left the United States than entered it. It's pretty remarkable when you think about the desire to move to the United States of America. It wasn't always true. The Great Depression was a very dark period of time in American history. But one thing that the book doesn't talk about, I think it was also a very unifying period of history. We had a radio, and even the poorest of people often had access to the radio, and people started having a sort of a universal consensus of the suffering. And I thought that tied the American people together. And I think that's what Doris Kearns Goodwin book does on No Ordinary Time. I think she really does a nice job encapsulating that sense of what it was like to be an aware person. My father, for example, was born during the Great Depression. He doesn't have any memories of it, but he was a big fan of oral histories, and he would often interview my grandfather, his dad, and other people during that era. And people that lived during that era have very unusual habits. My father would tell me about his grandfather would spend days taking old boards he found along the curb for trash pickup because there were nails in them that he could bring home, take them out of the boards and straighten them in the anvil, on an anvil and in a vise, because they were worth something, and he won't throw anything away. Very different era. And then we know Franklin Delano Roosevelt comes in, and he brings in the first New Deal, and it's to really save the economy. And he's going to dump money, our money, taxpayers' money, not to give it away. Some people have that philosophy that this is socialism or communism or things like that, but there needed to be some action. And during that era, and even beyond, for many, many people, it's viewed very, very much as a success story, not necessarily bringing rapid recovery. A lot of people think FDR brought in all these different work projects administration and other, I'm not going to name them all, the CCC and the works project, I can't remember all the different agencies that he created during this period of time, but they were significant. There were many, and they were designed to bring the economy back and to stabilize it. It did stabilize it, and it did slowly creep forward in the right direction. The problem, however, was it was slow. We did not get out of the recession because of all of the New Deal policies. We were edging forward to that recovery. It started the process of recovery, um, and it was widely viewed in a very popular fashion. He became probably the most popular president ever to have sit in the White House because of his activism. And a lot of people condemn that. A lot of people say that's not what government's supposed to be involved in. But so if you wanted to earmark some of the things that are both good and bad, depending on your philosophy, it expanded the role of government in our everyday lives, in business, in working conditions, in labor, in everything you can think of. Government stretched its tentacles into it. That, the way I'm saying it, makes it sound very, very negative. The positive aspect of it, as a result of all that government oversight, involvement, and regulation, the American economy became much more, I don't want to say equal, definitely didn't make it equal, but made it more equitable and more stable for the long haul. I think about like my brother's got a state pension. He just retired, but there are people out there that don't have any kind of pension. When they retire, what are they going to depend on? Social Security came during the Franklin Delano Roosevelt New Deal progression. Minimum wage came about during the New Deal. The workers' ability to unionize and have recognition by the federal government to have the right to do so. Although there was some argument that pre-existed FDR, FDR definitely protected it and expanded those principles so that workers could get a fair deal. And that's why it became the New Deal. And it was huge. The Agricultural Adjustment Administration, the National Recovery Administration, the New Deal was reshaping much of the nation, and there's no question about it. But what happens fairly soon thereon? In the South, it was very repugnant. The crash, I'm talking about the Depression, was very, very difficult in the South. South was already lagging behind, but it crushed even further because it's very agricultural. Agriculture takes the biggest hit during the Great Depression. But unfortunately, the AA, which gave money to farmers not to farm certain lands, backfired a little bit because those that were the landowners would often tell basically those that were renting and sharecroppers, you're no longer to farm that land, and they would still farm their own units, and they would retain the money from what was going to be the sharecroppers' use. So it kind of backfired on the poorest of the people in the South. Good intentions don't always lead to good outcomes. So there's some issues on there about how the South also backfired a bit. The National Labor Relations Act, which helped recognize collective bargaining units. Basically, people get together. We want to be recognized as a unit, and we want to make claims of unfair practices, both against unions and against employers. That came about in 1935, and that's still in existence to this day. I think most people, businesses and unions, think of it as a huge success, I believe, anyways. And so most employees, everyday workers that join unions, saw Roosevelt as a protector of workers' rights. I collect a lot of political memorabilia. My father was a big union guy, so I might as well tell you my bias. And he talked about stories about back in that era that when FDR died, that unions across the country mourned his loss because they thought him as a champion of the working people. Anyway, so the TVA came, the Tennessee Valley Authority brought electricity basically to Appalachia, and these people were really suffering, but also jobs and education. So a lot of things, it was really a social movement of human growth and improvement. But where did it come from? It came from the government. And I think that's the double-edged sword about it. We always want our government involved in that. Voices of Protest, one of my favorite characters in history, Huey Long, Share the Wealth program. He used to come out with a philosophy: if you had more than $100,000, you must have been a criminal to get it, or it should be a crime. And he basically wanted to strip the wealthy of all their wealth and distribute it to the common person. Very popular, especially in the southern regions. FDR saw him as a real threat to his progressive, because then there's obviously the conservative Republican, let business take care of business, government should be staying out, and this really doesn't have a role for government. That's not what government's purpose is. And then there's FDR, who was very proactive, but then there's guys like Huey Long that's saying, you're not doing enough. We've got to strip all the wealth and redistribute it. It's kind of communistic. And Huey Long was a great speaker, and what a interesting character he was in history. And that's where the term Huey and Dewey was his brother. He was big in Louisiana politics as well. And he bring up these analogies. It's like going to a dinner party where there's it's a pig roast and there's 100 people, but 90% of the pig's going to go to one guy at the end of the table, and there's 100 of us there. How is that fair and equitable? The wealth of the nation should be distributed more equally. And it became very, very popular. FDR saw him as a threat. Other progressives like Father Coughlin, who I always hated because he was a racist and a bigot, but he also believed that society should do more to make wealth equitable, at least for white people, white Protestant people. And I should probably Catholic. He was a Catholic. Father Coughlin had a radio show, was very popular. And if you listen to Woody Guthrie songs, many of his songs actually make fun of Father Coughlin because of his narrow-mindedness and his racial bigotry. Huey Long gets assassinated, I believe, by a doctor. It didn't say that in the book, but I remember from previous history by a doctor. So his movement doesn't die down completely, but without such a charismatic leader, it definitely fades in the distance. Yeah, here's the Reverend Charles Coughlin, a priest and a radio personality from the suburbs of Detroit, gained a following by making vitriolic, meaning hate-filled, anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish, right? Attacks on Roosevelt, even though Roosevelt's not a Jew by any means. Cooperating with banks and financiers and proposing a new system of social justice through a more state-driven economy instead. Like Long, both Townsend and Coughlin built substantial public followings, and these were guys that were much more radical. But in the end, FDR comes out looking as a hero, and these other ones look through history as being a bit narrow-minded and maybe a bit naive about how best to cure society's ills during the Great Depression. Now the backlash. The Supreme Court, all very conservative, don't believe government have a role doing these things. And there's enumerated powers under Article 1, Section 8. And they're saying the Work Projects Administration, the Agriculture Administration, all these different regulations that were coming in go beyond the power of the Constitution. Therefore, all of these acts and laws are unconstitutional. And people get surprised, wait a minute, how the Congress passed it, FDR endorsed it, the people loved it for the most part. How can the court it's not about popularity. It's not about whether the law is a good idea or a bad idea. It's about whether it's constitutional. And they shut it down. And so so basically FDR is a bit hamstrung. And this is one of the black eyes that FDR has. And there's talk of it to this day. Joe Biden saying this because we have conservative justices on the bench right now. Should Joe Biden seek congressional approval to expand the number of justices on the Supreme Court? There's nothing in the Constitution that caps it at 9. And so the court can be expanded by the president's appointment and the Senate's approval. And in fact, we've had different numbers than 9 all through history, but 9 has become the custom for almost 150 some odd years, or more really, probably 175 years. And FDR said, his logic, which wasn't fooling anybody, was many of the members of the court are older and elderly, and to make sure that the workload can be done, we need younger membership on the court. And so we probably, I don't think it was every number of somebody under 70, we'd appoint 2 other people or something like that. There was backlash everywhere. Democrats that loved them, liberals that loved them, progressives that loved them, Republicans that hated them. All of these different groups, not all Republicans hated him actually, but all these different groups said it's called a court packing scheme, basically putting on members of the court that would be his cronies, be people that supported his philosophical view about what government can and cannot do, would be put on the court. And that's the argument that Joe Biden should do, or in future, maybe it'll be a Republican conservative, that they should pack the court if they don't like the makeup of the court. I think it's very dangerous. It made FDR look very, very bad, even among his supporters, saying you really went too far with that. And there was a, if you look at history, some of the negative things he does, we'll get to that in World War II, also locking up over 100,000 Japanese Americans with no proof of any disloyalty whatsoever. And internment camps of World War II is another one of the things that FDR gets a negative thing on his sort of report card, if you will. But the court packing scheme, he didn't do it. He never sought to really do it. But what it may have had the impact of, guess what, the Supreme Court. So he started passing new legislation to try to fix the unconstitutional aspects of the old legislation, although it wasn't much different. And what did the Supreme Court start doing? Hey, this is constitutional under the taxation clause or under the commerce clause. It is going to pass constitutional muster. And some of the members of the Supreme Court do start retiring and or dying, and therefore FDR can start putting on more progressive justices, if you will. And some people, and Abe Fortas, who gets on the Supreme Court later, but as a young person commentating about it, says it was in the stitch in time that saves 9. And so it stayed as 9 members. As I remember, the stitch, basically the movement of the court starting to rule that FDR and the Congress's policies were in fact constitutional under the mandates of the Constitution or limits of the Constitution. We know equal rights during the New Deal does not do well, especially in his FDR, I think, was sympathetic to African Americans and in the suffering under the racial impacts of the South and other parts of the country, but especially in the South. But FDR, in order to get his things moving, he needed the support of Southern Democrats. And there's an unfortunate quote in the book, which is probably very true. When his wife was a big champion, Eleanor Roosevelt was a big champion of civil rights for African Americans. And they were pushing him to do legislation and or take action to basically give African Americans the same rights that were being experienced by whites. And his quote, and I believe it was probably true, was, "I just can't take that risk," because if he lost the Southern Democrats, his legislative policy can't go forward. And that goes back to the argument of even creating our Constitution initially, when the Southern states said we want the 3/5 clause, where slaves will count as 3/5 of a person for purposes of the census, or that you won't ban the foreign slave trade until 1808. Those kinds of compromises are often seen as a moral dilemma, because do you take half a loaf and progress society going forward, or do you fight and only try to seek the whole loaf and try to seek justice for everyone, when the reality is you probably get justice for no one? And that's a very difficult determination. FDR, we know, did not do anything overtly to fight for civil rights beyond the laws, hopefully they were applicable to African Americans too, but the treatment of African Americans, we know, was less than appropriate under the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution, equal protection and the voters' rights. And yet he did very little proactively to change that, knowing he'd lose Southern Democrats, which would curtail the whole New Deal. The New Deal failed to challenge core inequities that continued the mark of the life of the United States. He brought women up. As the first woman to ever hold a cabinet position was in FDR, Frances Perkins. She was the labor secretary in New York when he was the governor of New York. She becomes the first woman to head a executive level cabinet position, and Frances Perkins was the Secretary of Labor. Thought throughout history to have done a fantastic job. The court packing scheme. And the legacy of the New Deal, and I just underlined this and wrote key next to it, so it must be important. It says, after the New Deal, and this is true, Americans came to see the federal government as a potential ally in their daily struggles, whether finding work, securing a decent wage, getting a fair price for agricultural products, or organizing union. And that's true. Think about it. To this day, when there's emergencies, when there's national calamity, when there's things like a virus, we don't always look to private industry to take action. We look to the government, and that's a phenomenon that really developed during FDR's administration. Prior to that, that wasn't the role of government in most people's eyes. It really expanded significantly during FDR's. Whenever there's a problem now, what's the government going to do? And I think about running for office from time to time, and I know people that are on office, and sometimes I talk to them, how's it going? And, is it all glamorous? No, it's amazing how many times that they say we get people calling, their spouses are out of work, or their kid is having trouble getting a job just out of college, and they expect politicians to take, the government to take action to help them. And that's a phenomenon, I think, that was born more so during the New Deal and FDR than any other. But his popularity is unquestionable. He was elected 4 times. And as a result of his election, most people were disturbed. Even people that loved him say, hey, you got to be careful, because it's creating almost a monarchy, if you will, that he wasn't in for all 16 years. He died very early in his 4th term. But he probably could have kept winning and winning and winning. He was that much beloved by the nation, and I think still is to some degree. I know people that are very conservative who are really into politics also admire him greatly, because he took action. He took the presidential role and expanded it with more power than it ever had in history. And those of you that like actors, whether they act, inconsistent with your philosophy or not, you have to at least give him kudos for driving the ship. He didn't just leave it in harbor. He took it for a ride, and he rode it to the full hilt that he could. And I think genuinely trying to help all of America the best he could on some level. And there were some failings, no question about it. But when we get into World War II, the real truth of the matter is the Great Depression, although curtailed, slowed, and the ship was turning in the right direction because of FDR's economic policies and legislation. It was World War II, the gearing up for war, that ultimately ended the economic pitfalls of the Great Depression. Otherwise, be well, guys.